Well, welcome back to our read through the Bible, and today we're picking up in Numbers chapter 25. Brother Mike has led us to the end of Numbers 24. Now, before we jump into Numbers 25, I think it would do us good to do a little bit of review because I want us to keep in mind the time frames that we are dealing with. In other words, when Israel leaves Egypt, 1446 BC, they are going to come into the promised land, and you know this, 40 years later. And with reason, we say they wandered in the promised land for 40 years. And the reason for this wandering is that Israel leaves Egypt right after Passover on the 15th of Abib, again, 1446 BC. This is the date we're going to use. The date I believe is correct. Okay, they take roughly 2 months to get to Mount Sinai. They're at Mount Sinai for 11 months. They receive the law, all the instructions about building the tabernacle, all of the instructions that are given to them there, the pattern to follow. And then it takes them 11 more days. 2 months to Sinai, 11 months at Sinai, 11 days from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea where they spy out the land. So that's under 14 months. So in this period of time, 13 months, 11 days, they arrive in Kadesh Barnea. They go in, send in spies. The spies should come back with a report. This is how we're going to go into the land. This is how we're going to do it. But they come back, their hearts melted. We can't go in. There are giants in the land, fortified cities. We can't do it. The people disobey God. God said, go into the land. They disobeyed God. Only 2 came back with a good report. Who were they? Joshua and Caleb. So because their disobedience and their failure to go into the land, instead of arriving in the land in something like 14 months, they wander around, so it takes them 40 years before Joshua leads the children of Israel into the promised land. From 1446 BC, they leave Egypt, and in 1406 BC, Joshua leads them into the promised land. So this entire generation, and we'll deal with this in Numbers 26, this entire generation dies. A new generation that is born. These are the ones that go into the promised land. And so as you come into Numbers 25, that generation, for the most part, has now passed away. Just a few left to die, kind of the funeral narratives here. And so God is now bringing the children of Israel into the promised land. It's taken roughly 40 years. In fact, you are in the 40th year here. And they're kind of getting close. They're kind of come to this place called the Plains of Moab, just across the river from Jericho. And the people around them are scared to death. The Edomites are scared, the Ammonites, the Moabites are scared. They've already defeated 2 very powerful Amorite kings on the east side of the Jordan River, Sihon and Og. And as they go into Jericho, what the Bible will tell us there in the book of Joshua, that Rahab will say, our hearts were melted. Why did it take you so long? Well, they've actually been worried all along since they crossed the Red Sea. They crossed the Jordan River too. But, so God is working. So, the king of Moab, Balak, was so upset about this massive Israelite group, even though they had been careful not to infringe on the Moabites in many ways, saw them camped on the plains of Moab, and he's just really scared. And so he sends for this magician named Balaam, very famous. Remember Balaam's donkey and all of that? Mike led us through that last week. Okay, they send for him to curse the Israelites. But he warns them and he says, I can't curse them if God doesn't allow me to. But anyway, he comes anyway. So 4 times he tries to curse Israel, or Balak tries to get Balaam to curse Israel. But 4 times he winds up blessing. So Balak is just furious with Balaam. But in Numbers 25, Balak gives him this parting advice. Send in the women. What do you mean by that? Okay, Balaam tells Balak, don't you have this Baal of Peor, and it's kind of a worship through a sexual orgy, idolatry, and immorality kind of mixed together. Well, that worked on the Israelites. So they came in, and God is just furious with the nation of Israel. And so the son of Aaron, Eleazar, has a son named Phinehas. And Phinehas has this zeal for the Lord. So when he sees this Israelite man of the tribe of Simeon with this Moabite woman, he literally takes a spear and spears them literally in the act. And the zeal of Phinehas is a very famous concept throughout Scripture. And because he was faithfulness, God said, I give you my covenant peace. In other words, I give to Eleazar, to Aaron, his father Eleazar, and to Phinehas, the covenant of the priesthood. They will have the priest, the Aaronic priesthood, my covenant of peace. So, Numbers 25. And then in Numbers 26, again, on the plains of Moab, after the incident of the Baal of Peor, you have this numbering, this census taking place. Remember, that entire generation died away. And if you go back into earlier, and you go back and you do the numbering, the first census that was taken at Mount Sinai, and the book of Numbers is all about numbers, obviously. Go into very early in the book of Numbers, you will see that there, when they numbered the men of war, there were 603,550. Now, these 38 years later, the second census is taken. There are 601,730, almost identical. Now, the tribes will go up and down. For example, Simeon will have a massive loss of people, a minus 37,000. Manasseh will have a massive increase of people, plus 20,000. But the big thing is the total number of men of war is very, very, very similar. It dropped a very slight amount, 603,550 to 601,730, but it's very close. And actually, the numbering of the Levites, there are about 1,000 more Levites. But so God has done what he said. That one generation has passed away, and God has now replaced it. So of that generation that did not trust God, only two, remember who they were? Joshua and Caleb. Not even Moses, Aaron, Miriam, all that generation passes away. They don't go into the promised land. And then so God is now setting up on the plains of Moab. Remember, very shortly they're going to come in the promised land. He's reminding them, in the book of Deuteronomy especially, because a second giving of the law, he's reminding them of what should be done. And then 5 daughters of a man named Zehoshaphat come and tell Moses, they say, hey, our dad did not have any sons, just us 5 daughters. And so we would like a portion of the land so our father's name will be preserved. And so Moses confirms this with the Lord, and he gives this, that the name of a family would be preserved. And here with the daughters of Zehoshaphat, they're going to preserve that name. It's kind of interesting. And then also in this chapter, it reminds us again that Joshua is going to succeed Moses. And Joshua is publicly commissioned while Moses is still around. In fact, this is going to be seen again in the book of Deuteronomy. Joshua is going to be publicly commissioned so the people will have respect for him. And then in chapters 28 and 29, quickly we'll talk about this. It kind of talks again about the rhythm of worship, that there would be daily sacrifices, there would be weekly sacrifices, there would be new moon monthly sacrifices, there would be these very special holy days, there would be Passover on the 14th day of the first month, there would be the Feast of Unleavened Bread. 50 days later after this, there would be the Feast of Weeks, which in the New Testament was going to coincide with Pentecost. And then in chapter 29, it talks about a very special month, the 7th month, the month of Tishri, how it would begin on the very first day with the Feast of Trumpets, and then on the 10th day with the most important day of the year, the Day of Atonement. Remember how we spent so much time in Leviticus chapter 16 talking about all the details there, the offerings that would take place. Then on the 15th day of the month, the Feast of Tabernacles. So you have this rhythm of worship continually reminding the people of who God was and how he was to be worshiped. You say, why this repetition of worship, the sacrifices over and over again? How long does it take for us to forget about God? See, that's the problem. We forget about God. And every time we get a blessing, we tend to think, hey, we can do this on our own. We don't need God. So Israel's worship was to be a continual memorial, a continual reminder, and how we need that. Things have not changed. And then in Numbers 30, it talked about the vows that we take and how we need to be very careful to follow through, and how a man is given leadership here. This is very interesting because if a young woman, you kind of understand this, makes a vow and her father says, no, that vow is not important. He had the power to rescind that vow. But even when a woman gets married, her husband could rescind a vow that she had made. Now, if he hears about it and says nothing, the vow stands. Now, obviously, for a widow or a divorced woman or something of this nature, whatever vow she made, she was expected to fulfill. And the last chapter we're going to kind of talk about today, chapter 31, is really interesting because it talks about the Midianites. Remember the Midianites in Moab. The Midianites were scattered out kind of all over the place at this time. But the Midianites in Moab had been very instrumental in kind of encouraging and enticing the Israelites to participate in the Baal of Peor. Remember the situation of Phinehas, how he killed those and stopped the plague of God's judgment was coming on them. 24,000 were killed, and he stayed the plague there of God's judgment. Well, so Moses, before his death, said, look, God has told me to get an army, 1,000 from each of the 12 tribes, 12,000 men, and go and attack the Midianites. Don't have anything to do with them. We're going to eradicate them because they were instrumental in leading us astray. You cannot have sin coming in. So they go out, they kill the women, they bring back the men and the children. And Moses is even upset with this because, he said, okay, we can keep the virgin women, but these young men that'll grow up can't have those. And the women that had already participated in these orgies, these Baal worships, idolatry and immorality kind of mixed together. So the ban is upon them. And it's kind of interesting, we don't kind of understand this in our culture and society, but God says, purify yourselves from them. So they did. And so they actually put to death those that would lead astray, and they go through these purification rites, and everything is purified, and they come back in. Now, the 31st chapter of Numbers closes with the spoil that was taken from the Midianites is divided equally. In other words, those that went to war got their portion, and those that stayed back got their portion. Now, they all give a tithe and offering, and the Bible brings us out how important it is, the tithe, and we'll talk about this again when we get into the book of Deuteronomy, how this is important. But it's interesting, it closes with this concept. The men that went to war realized how God had preserved every single one of them against the Midianites. And they bring this offering to the Lord. And so you see this cycle. There's this continual sense that God is with us. He's taking care of us. Obedience brings blessing and disobedience brings chastisement. We need to remember to worship God. We can't forget this, how important this is, and we should never forget that lesson ourselves. God bless you. Read the Bible. You may not understand everything about it. And in the Old Testament, some of the things seem a little bit different. But you can see the concept of God's holiness. Remember the Lord your God and make him holy in your life. God bless you.